Hello everyone and welcome to another Elden Ring video. Today I'm going to be going over the spell changes in patch 1.04. I'm going to try and make this a quick video. I'm just going to go over really quickly whether I think the spell has changed significantly enough to make it worth using or not. So starting off the list with Crystal Barrage, I still think this spell is kind of doo-doo. It doesn't do that much damage and it functions pretty much like Comet Azure, except weaker. It locks you in place for a long period of time. I think this spell still gets like a low C. Gavel of Haima is incredibly good now. This spell is quick, it does a ton of damage, it gives you poise while you're casting it, and the AoE is massive. This is maybe a mid-S spell now, it's very good. Shattered Earth, not very good still. It doesn't do that much damage, it's still pretty slow. The extra poise is nice if you're trying to use it, but still for the most part, I wouldn't recommend it. Rock Blaster is decent. I know Revion recently came out with a video showcasing him just holding down the precast and gunning people down with it. That doesn't make it good though, it's pretty easy to just not get hit by that, although the extra poise is nice. I think I would give this a high C. Thopsis Barrier, I don't understand the point of. Eternal Darkness is just better in almost every way. They would have to buff this spell a lot for me to consider using it. The two moon spells I still don't think are very good. Even with the increased cast speed, these are both still incredibly slow. It's not that they don't do enough damage, but in terms of how often you're going to get this off because of how slow it is, especially compared to how much mana they cost, I just don't think it's that worth using. Karian Greatsword is incredible now. This spell is great. This is like a low S probably. It does more damage than a Duelist Moonblade after this patch, unless you hit both the projectile and the sword of the Moonblade. Very worth using. Magma Shot I'm not a big fan of. It doesn't do that much damage and the arc it travels is kind of weird. The decreased FP cost is nice, but still probably not worth using. High C. Roiling Magma is a lot better. If it does a direct hit, it does a lot of damage, and it does that little mine on the ground. The increased cast speed bumps this up a lot in my opinion. This is now a reasonable option for a fire damage spell. Probably a mid to high B. Gelmir's Fury is still not that good. It's still super random. The projectiles don't do that much damage. And although the lava damage is pretty decent, most enemies aren't going to get hit by it very much. Maybe if you're against a really big boss, you can just nuke them under it with this. I think this one gets a high C. Riker's Rancor, somewhat worth using now, which I'm very happy about because I think it's a really cool looking spell. The decreased FP cost means that you can justify it much more easily, and if you can get multiple explosions to hit, the damage is pretty good. It's just a weird spell to use. It's not that good in most situations, but when it does pop off, it is quite good. Oracle Bubbles, increased cast speed doesn't change the fact that it has the range of a swung potato. Not incredible. Great Oracular Bubble, however, is now pretty worth using. It does a good amount of damage, and it casts relatively quickly. The range on it is pretty good too, actually. It goes for a pretty long time, and it doesn't fizzle out. Once it reaches max range, it just sits there and then explodes after a duration. I think this is maybe a low A. Briars of Sin is okay. It really needs some increased range or increased cast speed. It takes a really long time to cast. The recovery increase is nice, but it's not a game changer. High C. Briars of Punishment still does a lot of damage. It takes a pretty long time to cast, which is unfortunate. But if you're in a situation where you can cast this over and over again at an enemy, it's definitely going to chunk them, especially if you get some blood loss off. Probably a low B. Explosive Ghost Flame still kind of sucks. It's not that it's lacking damage, and the cast speed is fine, but you're stuck in the animation for such a long time after the explosion goes off that in PvP if someone rolls through it they're still going to hit you, and in PvE they're just going to walk through the flames and hit you, so it's still not worth using. Tibia's Summon is kind of usable now. It's still not great. Even when you hit all three swings, it doesn't do as much damage as some other spells, so I think I would probably rather use those. It is definitely usable though, so if you like the aesthetic, then go ahead. Probably a low B. And now we're moving on into the incantations. Both aspects of the Crucible I thought were very good already. The decreased FP cost just makes them even better, and especially Horns, getting more poise damage and more distance travel when not charged really just makes this an incredible incantation. Elden Stars still doesn't do any damage for its mana cost. It still takes way too long to cast for its mana cost. You can't move forever. Still not worth using. Even against enemies that are weak to Holy, it only does 1200 damage, assuming everything hits. Maybe not unusable, but still mid-C. Black Blade was worth using before, and it's even better now. It's not a game changer. It's not going to go all the way to the top of S, but it's absolutely still worth using and still high A. Discus of Light and Triple Rings of Light are both pretty good now. They do decent damage, and either can be a pretty good ranged option. Unfortunately, neither are top tier ranged options for Faith builds, but they're definitely usable now, and I think they would both get low Bs. Radagon's Rings of Light is a pretty good crowd control option now. It does decent damage. It casts relatively quickly. I think as far as crowd control options go, I would rather use Triple Rings of Light, but this incantation is okay. Low B to high C. Lightning Strike, honestly, was already good. I already put it in high A. This is probably a low to mid S now. I think it's great, and I think you should use it. Hone Bolt, I put mid to high S last time, and they buffed it for no real reason. This is still high S. It's still very good. Ancient Dragon's Lightning Spear definitely hits a little quicker. It makes it a little easier to get off. I think now it's a pretty decent melee range lightning damage option. I don't know if I would put it in A, maybe a high B. Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike was already good if you're nuking down bosses with it. This just makes it even better. Still high A, still worth using. Lanceau's Glaive, pretty decent. This is actually one of the better Faith crowd control options. The decreased FP and stamina cost and cast speed really helped, and the extra poise doesn't hurt either. I think this is a mid-A. Fortisax's Lightning Spear is unfortunately still pretty slow. It feels like they only sped up the first hit of it. The extra poise is nice, and the decreased FP and stamina cost are both nice as well, but I think the increased speed of only hitting one spear is just better. This one's gonna get a low B. Frozen Lightning Spear I think was already good against big bosses, and in that sense it's even better. Mid to high A for that. For anything else, I think it's still too slow to be worth using. Although if you are in a situation where you could trade with someone, the extra poise is going to help with that a lot. Death Lightning is still good for nuking down bosses. The decreased FP cost helps with that. And the increased duration of the death accumulating smoke, although definitely not useful in PvE, might make it more of a threat in PvP. I think this is still a high A. They say O Flame increased its damage, but it's still only like 100 more damage than Catch Flame, and Catch Flame is a lot quicker and can be combo cast. It's not that O Flame is bad, but Catch Flame is literally just better in almost every way. So this is gonna stay in high A. Giant's Flame Take Thee was already really good. Decreased stamina cost just makes it even better, and this is going to stay mid to high A. Flame of the Fell God does incredibly large amounts of damage now, and the decreased FP cost helps it a lot. It's still not very good in PvP because of the big indicator for when you need to roll, but in PvE, especially against bosses, this is really good, and I think this is going to get a low A. Whirl O Flame, still not great. The increased damage helps it, but there are so many better options for how long you're locked in place that this is just going to stay a low B, if that. Burn O Flame is very good. It was good before. Increased cast speed and decreased recovery time just makes it better. This is going to stay high A. I don't think it breaks into S. I was really down on Black Flame during my incantations tier list. I said it didn't do enough damage. That is absolutely not the case now. This incantation is incredible. The only downside is that the AoE isn't that big, which makes Giant's Flame Take Thee a little better in PvP, but when you can get Black Flame to hit, it just does so much damage, and I think it's the best fireball spell for PvE. Scouring Black Flame is pretty good now, actually. It still does good damage, and the increased attack range is absolutely needed on it, and it helps it a lot, especially if you're running a fire build or a black fire build with the Godslayer's seal. This is definitely worth adding to your arsenal now, and I think it gets a high B to low A. Black Flame Ritual is just as good as it was before. You cast this underneath the boss, and it does a lot of immediate damage and some really good burn damage. The reduced FP cost and increased damage is just a cherry on top of the cake. This keeps its high A rating. Gerank's Beast Claw I don't think is very good still. The extra damage is nice, but I still think I would just rather use the regular Beast Claw, and even that isn't that good, so this is going to stay mid-C range. Bloodflame Talons, decreased FP cost and increased cast speed is very nice. This is now incredibly good against bosses, just getting right in their face, casting it, and having it explode for good damage and bleed buildup. In PvP, it's not as good, although if someone is stupid enough to stay in range for the explosion, you can combo hits off, and that makes it decent. For its PvE performance, I think I'd probably give it a high B. Blood Boon, I put in mid S before, and it is high S now. This incantation is so incredibly good. You can move while casting it. It does good damage. It does bleed build up. If you get someone to stand on the fire, it does even more bleed build up. And it's incredibly fast. Absolutely high S after the buffs. Pest Threads, the use case didn't change. It's still only good for big bosses where they can penetrate the boss for a really long time. Decreased stamina cost is okay, that's fine, but it doesn't increase its ranking at all. Scarlet Aeonia is kind of useful now. The extra poise it gives is a lot. You'll definitely be able to tank through plenty of hits. Unfortunately, I still don't think it's worth using. It takes forever to go off, even with the increased cast speed. And if you don't land the initial explosion, the ticks afterwards really don't do that much damage. And you're still locked in the animation forever. It feels awful. I'm gonna go ahead and say this is still a D do not use, even after the buff. Unendurable Frenzy is still pretty decent. Unfortunately, they nerfed the infinite mana strategy in this patch as well. So you can't stand in enemies' faces with infinite mana and just burst them down with this. But it is definitely something to consider now, especially because the Flame of Frenzy was nerfed. Probably a high B. Inescapable Frenzy was buffed a lot. The cast speed on this is insanely fast. Unfortunately, it still doesn't work on almost every enemy in PvE, so it's still not that good. In PvP though, this is fast enough that if you're in range, you might actually get it off without someone rolling. So this is probably going to get a low B for that. Placidusax's Ruin was already good. Decreased FP and stamina cost just makes it even better. This is now a mid to high A, I think. Dragonclaw also was already good, and decreased FP stamina cost recovery time makes it even better. Increased poise damage makes it even better. As far as dragon incantations go, this is still absolutely high S tier. All these buffs to Dragon Maw are nice, but they don't fix the issue that Dragon Maw had, which was almost negligible range and tracking. The FP and stamina cost is nice, and the cast speed is nice as well. If you can get this to land, if you can find the opening, this is going to do a ton of damage, but you have to make sure that you're standing right on top of the enemy to do it. Probably pretty decent in boss fights now, maybe a high C. Grail's Roar was also already good, and all of these buffs just make it better. Still absolutely worth using. Still a high A to low S. Adula's Moonblade got hit pretty hard. The damage is nowhere near what it used to be, but it still does pump out really good damage and frost buildup when you hit both the projectile and the blade. Definitely not high S anymore, but still low S in my opinion. I think this is still very, very good, especially in PvE. I mentioned in my incantations tier list that this is a change I might want to see for Flame Fall Upon them. However, it doesn't work the way you might think it does. It seems like projectiles only spawn at a certain distance, and of course, the further the distance, the less likely that multiple are going to hit. So whereas before this was doing 1,000 damage with a single projectile, now it feels like you need to hit several to get that same amount of damage. In my opinion, this spell actually got worse, despite ostensibly being a buff. Howl of Shibriri I still think is decent. I think the increased cast speed and decreased recovery time make it still decent for Oki in PvP, and the buff of course is still massive. 20% to all damage output is incredible, and I think as far as buffs go, this is a high B. And finally, the nerfs. Swarm of Flies still does good damage. It's still a great pressure option in PvP, and although it says it did nerf the blood loss buildup, it's still decent. You're still gonna get a proc off with this spell. This is maybe not high S anymore, but I still think low S as far as incantations go. Flame of Frenzy still does incredible damage. The decreased madness buildup is definitely more of a PvP concern. In terms of PvE, this is still great and still worth using all the time. In PvP, still probably worth using as well, especially if you're boosting it using the Frenzied Flame Seal, but definitely a knockdown for that decreased chance of madness proc. Probably a mid to high B. Frenzy Burst is still an S, absolutely no question. It's still the longest range spell in the game. It still does very good damage. It's incredible in PvE for its range and its damage. The decreased madness buildup, again, doesn't have much an effect in PvE, so that doesn't really matter. In PvP, you're definitely less likely to get the instant madness proc that some people were getting before, but I think the overall utility of this spell didn't change, so still mid S. And that brings us to the end of the spell changes. I hope everyone enjoyed this video, and if you have any comments or feedback, feel free to let me know. As always, dropping a like and subscribe does a lot to tell me that you like to see my videos, and it tells YouTube to show my videos to more people, and I appreciate both of them greatly. As of right now, we're almost at 30 subscribers, which is just insane to me, but regardless, I hope all of you have a wonderful day.